Mental health is a regular topic here on the Jersey Magazine, and my guest this morning, Morra Aarons-Mele, is an author, an entrepreneur, a communications executive, and has a book that has just recently been published called The Anxious Achiever: Turn Your Biggest Fears into Your Leadership Superpower. Morra, good morning and welcome.
Hi, Jim. How are you?
I'm good. I'm not as anxious as I thought I would be, to be honest with you. Anytime I do one of these interviews, I'm always a little bit anxious. I want to make sure the first question's good and make sure I make a good presentation. And that's a good kind of anxiety, I would think.
Yes, absolutely. You don't want to walk into an interview with the same level of energy you might have, if you wake up at 6 a.m. on a Sunday and you're really sleepy and you don't want to get out of bed. I mean, anxiety exists for a reason. And anxiety is basically our body's response to a perceived threat. But it's also our response to something that we are really invested in, that we care about, and that we're nervous about.
So when does anxiety turn bad to the point where it becomes, in some cases for people, debilitating?
That's right. Anxiety is a mental illness as well. I think the easiest way to think about it is on a spectrum, right? A lot of mental health, a lot of issues that we have are on a spectrum. And so at that top end of the spectrum would be what we just talked about, what neuroscientists call good anxiety. And I think the way to think about this is that it's time delimited, right? You feel nervous and you feel anxious and you have a lot of energy and all that right before, and maybe for the first few questions, but hopefully it subsides and afterwards you're okay and you go on about your day and the anxiety fades, right? It's time delimited. And it's around an event or a specific situation, right? The thing about as we get down the spectrum of anxiety is that it's less about a specific event and it can become more chronic and much more difficult. And so at the bottom end of the spectrum is that clinical anxiety disorder that is very, very, very common. And even those of us who have clinical anxiety disorders, who have had panic attacks so bad that they've sent us to the ER, for example, when we can get treatment, we can function pretty well. We can manage our anxiety. And every once in a while, it's going to rear up and maybe it's going to take us down for a bit, but we can function. And if you're feeling like your anxiety has got you in a place where everyday life is difficult, I really encourage you to please get professional help. Ask your GP. If you can go to therapy, that's great. There's so many options. And in the middle of the spectrum is really where my book is focused on, which is chronic, moderate anxiety that many of us feel. A lot of us are just sort of born with it, and that's how we operate and we manage it. And many of us in this world right now are feeling really, really anxious, and we're noticing it, especially in our workday.
Now, I was just going to ask you, as I was listening to you describe those three kinds, does good or can good type of anxiety turn into bad? Can one lead almost like a gateway drug, if you will?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. There's so much, and I'm not a scientist. There is, I think, so much still to be learned about the brain. And there are people who would say that some of us are just born more anxious, or because of our upbringing, and maybe also because of our chemistry, we are more anxious. And there are some people who could be in situations where they're anxious because they are doing a TED talk, but their normal baseline is not anxious and they would never become clinically anxious. So I think the big answer is yes, probably, but there's a lot people still don't know. I think, though, that everybody is going to experience anxiety, everybody. And so it's really important that we understand what it looks like and that we can talk about it so people who are feeling anxious don't feel stigmatized.
What do you think the effect of COVID has had on people's anxiety?
Well, I mean, you see the statistics, right, about our mental health in general, and it's just terrible. I mean, 90% of Americans think we're in a mental health crisis in this country. And what's really interesting to me as a workplace person is that 84% of Americans said that work contributes to their negative mental health. And so our mental health as a country is awful. And I think it's something, again, that we have to deal with because it exists at micro levels and at macro levels. Mental health is a social issue. It's a systemic issue. It's grounded in all the biases and prejudices that we face. And yet it's also an inner and a personal thing. And so we have to approach it at a lot of different levels.
From one part of, speaking personally now, from a radio end of things, not a lot changed for me COVID wise, because I'm in a room by myself for the most part when I'm doing a radio show. So that really didn't change. The interaction in the office did. I had mentioned to you before we came on, I coach baseball. That completely shut down.
Yeah.
I mean, it was gone. So, that completely changed. But, in terms of just the job, what I do in terms of radio, there was really not that much of a difference. In fact, some years ago, I had to go through some kind of a personality thing where another place that I was working in addition to radio, and they came up with, why can't you be more like Radio Jim when you're here? Because when I was there, I was kind of quiet and to myself and pretty introverted. And I said, well, Radio Jim sits in a room by himself and just turns a microphone on and talks to one person. That's the trick in radio. You just talk to one person you imagine. So it could be a friend or spouse, whatever, kid. And that was easy.
Yeah.
But, once you get out into the quote unquote real world, well, then that's where things start to change. So Radio Jim couldn't be Radio Jim in that sense. So in some ways, COVID, was I don't want to say good because we all know what happened with it, but in some ways it enabled me to stay that introvert for a while and not have to deal with a lot of things.
Yeah, it's funny. I also am an introvert and I have social anxiety. And so for me, the insularity of COVID was actually very reassuring. But I think what you pointed out with your baseball team is what has affected a lot of us. And the Surgeon General just brought this up, that we have a loneliness epidemic. And, that's not good for our mental health. I mean, to me, the big thing about COVID that brought into stark relief for a lot of us is that many of us felt like we had a little bit of control in our life, that we could, if we worked hard enough, if we're good people, if we show up every day, things are basically going to be okay in America. And COVID really stripped that fantasy bare. Now, some people have always known that to be true, but I think for a lot of us, it was like, I work hard, things are going to be okay. And I think now we're realizing no. And that makes us extremely anxious.
Morra Aarons-Mele, my guest this morning on Jersey Magazine here at 105.5 WDHA. Her latest book, The Anxious Achiever, Turn Your Biggest Fears into Your Leadership Superpower. What do you think the effect of social media has had on anxiety, Morra?
I mean, the data is pretty clear, right? It's not good. Social media really triggers a lot of the really fundamental human soft points that make us anxious, right? Comparing ourselves to other people, questioning our own value, questioning if people like us, if we're worthy, if we're dateable or marriageable, if we make enough money. It just really makes us vulnerable to really common fears and anxieties that most of us have. And it's not healthy. I mean, I think the way that most of us work, if we're knowledge workers beyond social media, is just a recipe for anxiety. When you think about email and Slack and Teams and the constant and texting and the constant connectivity and endless Zooms and then checking social media, not only are our brains not meant for this, our self-esteem is really not meant for this. I always joke that the reply all email chain is people being anxious and trying to prove that they belong at their jobs.
Interesting. That's one of the banes of for me, email, the reply all.
Everyone.
Oh, God,
everyone.
if we could find a way to stop that. I think, and I've made this point with a few guests before, that social media really turns into people's greatest hits because you don't see what's behind the veneer of all of that. But going a little bit further into this, what do you think is the effect on, various ages, an adult versus a teenager versus a pre-teenager?
Yeah. I mean, again, the data is pretty clear, right? And There's a new movement called Wait Until Eighth that I think I wish I had known for my younger children, but really trying to get parents to wait to give their kids a phone, because those tween years are really, really vulnerable, right? I mean, I think we can all think back to middle school and be like, oh my God, I don't want to do that again, right? We're just so vulnerable in social media. Again, it just preys on us. But I see it across young people. They have access to everything at their fingertips. And that is really challenging. And again, all those triggers of the shoulds and the comparisons and the am I worthy, it just makes us vulnerable. It makes grown-ups vulnerable too. It decimates our attention span. I owned a social media marketing company for 11 years. I have been in social media before it was called social media, when it was called Web 2.0. I was a blogger. I worked on message boards, and I've seen the evolution of online community into a place that I really don't recognize. It's become very much about people, again, to your point, curating our lives and creating a brand. But on the other hand, I have deep empathy for that, because let's face it, most people aren't going to be taken care of by their jobs. There's no loyalty. So the feeling that you've got to stand out on your own, to me, is really understandable, even though it makes us really anxious.
I think employers would probably argue that the loyalty is the paycheck that you receive every 2 weeks. That would be.
I am hearing horror stories, Jim, of how people are getting laid off in this economy, how people are getting treated, and it's shocking.
I had mentioned to you before we came on that I had first discovered you through a segment called Coffee with Kim, and Kim being Kim Kaup, who's actually been a guest here on Jersey Magazine. And the interview that you did with her was fascinating. But one of the things that stood out especially and really got my attention was when you and Kim were discussing imposter syndrome.
Yeah.
And that feeling like, oh, I'm not good enough to do this. What am I doing here? I don't belong here. And I've had that happen a few times in my career, both in radio and in baseball and some other things. For you, what is that like, imposter syndrome?
I mean, it's anxiety. It's a feeling where you have immense self-doubt, and you fear being shamed. You fear all those middle school feelings. I mean, that's one of the best ways I can,
Yes, there it is.
It's those middle school feelings. I mean, I think we can all remember what it feels like to walk into the cafeteria holding your lunch and thinking, nobody wants to sit with me. And imposter syndrome is kind of a grown-up version of that. What's really interesting about imposter syndrome is that it affects everyone. It affects men, it affects women, it affects people who have a lot of social privilege and people who don't. But there's a real pushback right now against the concept of imposter syndrome, because people who are people of color, women, people with disabilities, people who are, quote, different, are starting to realize that a lot of the mythology around imposter syndrome is really about us having to work in systems that treat us like imposters. So imposter syndrome is really complex because we feel it very personally.
Oh, very much so.
Very
No
personally.
question.
But a lot of us are working in places that treat us like imposters. So again, there's so many layers to this stuff. But I think that imposter feeling is one of the most common. It actually, as you get more successful, there is data that you feel it more. There's also data that people who feel imposter syndrome are more collaborative, have greater social skills and team-making skills. And so the experience of imposter syndrome can be painful, but it can also give you skills in our modern work culture.
I found this definition that I'm reading here. Imposter syndrome happens when you forget that you are capable of incredible things. The mind has the tendency to look at others and think of them as special, all the while lacking to acknowledge that you too have unique capabilities that are admirable. And, I think back, and this was early in my radio career, someone suggested you should do voiceover work. Like, okay. And I remember going to an audition, and there were 3 gentlemen in the waiting room waiting to go in, and I'm looking at them, and they were all extremely well-known voiceover artists. They had done radio, and I'm sitting there going, I have absolutely no business being here. So part of that was the imposter syndrome, and the other part of it more was, I don't have the experience. I don't have the talent yet to do this. So there was a level of self-awareness that, like where's the dividing line between imposter syndrome? Well, I'm not good enough to do this, and I'm not ready to do this yet.
I mean, that's the thing, is anxiety is often telling you something. And the question is, are you going to listen to it? Are you going to take it seriously? And your point is a really great one. Sometimes imposter syndrome is what I call a thought trap. It's that automatic negative thought that we do to ourselves, and it has no basis in reality. It's just pure anxiety. And it's like, you know what? I'm feeling imposter syndrome because I'm doing something new and I'm scared as hell and I really want to do this and I'm having a lot of self-doubt. But you know what? I'm here. I'm in this room for a reason. Shut up, imposter syndrome. Sometimes, I mean, I had the same experience around my book where I would get terrible imposter syndrome if I was with someone who had a PhD, right? And who was a clinical psychologist and I don't. And I would feel like a total imposter. And to your point, what I realized was I want to get that training. That's actually my anxiety telling me that there is something that I want to do, and that's okay. And so, yeah, you probably weren't ready, but you showed up. Mm-hmm. You did it. Did you get the work?
No, I did not. And I knew I wasn't going to, and maybe that did affect the audition that I gave. But fast forward some years later, and I did get a voiceover for a local automobile dealership, and they seemed to like what I was doing until one day someone said, "We need you to sound like Sam Elliott."
Wow.
And I said, well, that's not going to happen. I can't get my voice down there. If I could, I wouldn't be able to do it for very long. I said, I'm afraid you're going to have to go get Sam Elliott. Well, now, obviously, he charges a heck of a lot more. But that was like, and there was no imposter syndrome there. I know that I can't do and bring to the table what Sam Elliott does. I mean, that is a world-class voice right there. But I just told him, you're going to have to go pay for Sam. Sorry.
Yeah. I mean, that's the thing, is that we learn. And that's, I mean, to me, that's also a great thing about like growing older and getting experience is, the things that used to make you anxious don't, who you are more. And so, I think a lot of us, and this is really a big piece of the anxious achiever, is that we carry these anxieties around out of habit. And sometimes it's just time to get rid of them and say, I'm not going to feel like an imposter anymore, even if I don't get the job. I'm not going to feel like I'm bad just because I get criticism anymore. I'm not going to think that everything I do has to be perfect just because that's what I've always done. And that's really amazing. And we have a lot of power within ourselves.
Morra Aarons-Mele is my guest this morning here on Jersey Magazine. One of the other books that you've written, this is one of my all-time favorite titles of a book, Hiding in the Bathroom, An Introvert's Guide. I mean, that just, because we've all done that. We've all been that person hiding in the bathroom because I don't want to be here. How do I get out of this? Where did that title come from?
It came from a conversation. I'm part of an entrepreneur community, and this was the subject line in an email. And I said, do you ever hide in the bathroom at professional conferences? And the response to the email, just from the women in my community, was so overwhelming that actually a woman from Forbes magazine was in the group, and she said, this is a great concept for a podcast. And they were launching the inaugural Forbes podcast network. And I was one of the first podcasts, and Hiding in the Bathroom was about exploring how we introverts and people with social anxiety, because they're different, but who have really big ambitions, have big goals, want to become entrepreneurs or leaders, can really create systems and supports and habits that play to our strengths while mitigating the harder sides of being an introvert or someone with social anxiety in a world that really is just too extroverted.
Morra, for listeners who want to learn more about you, how do they reach out?
Well, you can find me on LinkedIn. Actually, I spend a lot of time on LinkedIn. It's social media that I really like, actually. So please, if you have a question, you can message me there. And I'd love if you listen to my podcast called The Anxious Achiever and buy the book.
And you can also go online to Morra, that's MORRAAM.com, MorraAM.com. Morra Aarons-Mele, thank you so much for joining us this morning. Again, the book is called The Anxious Achiever, Turn Your Biggest Fears into Your Leadership Superpower. Best of luck with the book and your podcast, and thank you once again.
Thanks, Jim, so much.